We're gonna watch Force Gaming. Force Gaming has done a ton of news on the situation about Dark and Darker. If you guys aren't aware, or if you haven't followed, Dark and Darker released. They were created by a couple of people that left Nexon, created Iron Mace Gaming. After that, Nexon had started lawsuits, and it went down this whole legal rabbit hole that involved them getting ripped off of Steam. They went to the U.S. courts. The U.S. courts said this isn't the proper venue for the lawsuit because both your companies are in South Korea. So we're going to send it back to the South Korean court. The only reason you looked for aid in this venue is because of Steam being headquartered out of, I believe, Washington State. And we're not going to hear the case because the case needs to be litigated internationally where your companies are headquartered. And that's kind of where the case sits right now. That being said, Dark and Darker has done things that led to them releasing the game via third-party launchers and a independent website outside of Steam. It has a massive fan base. People want the game to come out because it was a really good and engaging game. But Force Gaming has followed all of that news and delivered a lot of updates on the news, and he has a huge amount of information about how this is played out. So he just released a video about what is happening and the current state of Dark and Darker. Well, let's get into it.
Dark and Darker, man, absolutely one of the more pleasant surprises in all of gaming over these past 12 months. The title first appeared on Steam back in June of last year, and in the subsequent months ran alpha testing that quickly garnered a ton of attention, culminating in February of this year with a test that peaked at nearly 100,000 concurrent users. 100,000 people all playing simultaneously for an alpha of an unknown game from a brand new developer, reaching.
And this is what's nice about the game. It is a fresh IP that has a unique take on kind of a genre mashup between looter extraction and fantasy magic. It's a dungeon crawler. It's really exciting. It was fun to play, and it is a very unique and fun experience, which is why I hope it continues to progress because it's such a great game.
Those kind of numbers were really impressive, quite the feat, and it happened for a good reason, because Dark and Darker was really, really good. The game took the basic loop of the extraction shooter genre, but replaced the guns and Kevlar in a military setting with swords and magic in a fantasy setting. For me, I'll say Dark and Darker, I think, just really
like another thing is it's so balanced. Like you can have the joy and excitement of playing multiple different characters and still have a well-rounded, balanced experience. I think they did so much due diligence and time in the development of this game just to make it an absolute gem of a brand new IP in the current gaming setting.
Delivered on that feeling of a dungeon diving adventure, tasking you with navigating through dark dungeons full of surprises, all sorts of deadly traps and creatures, along with other players who are eager to kill you and steal all of your stuff. Your goal was simply to survive, collect as much loot as you could, and then try to escape, with all of the variables and everything that could go wrong going wrong, making for a really entertaining and thrilling experience.
Everything
the change of setting aside, the game just seemed to strike all.
Like, to be fair, like we'd go in, and I played this with a couple different people, a couple different times, a couple different ways. And every time you thought like you had control of the situation, some random zombie would come in, and then you're fighting that random zombie, and then, oh no, I hear a player's coming in, the player's gonna fight me, well, I fight the zombie's aggroed on me, the player's attacking me. It just turned to chaos so quickly, and you had such the feeling of like high stakes in the game because it was hard to get out and like be successful on a run. It's beautiful game.
all of the right balances to create something that felt fresh, new, and novel, which, as we all know, can be really hard to come by. But anyway, yes, Dark and Darker was really fun. A lot of people were really enjoying it. I myself had a blast with each and every playtest and was looking forward to its eventual upcoming release, which was slated for some time this year. But then, much like can happen in the game itself, everything went very south very quickly. In February, around the same time their record high player count alpha test took place, reports started popping up. We started seeing articles and Reddit threads online about Nexon claiming that Dark and Darker was full of stolen assets and code, or was at best a complete ripoff of a game that they had in development. The reason for these claims being that Iron Mace's co-founder was a former Nexon employee who up until the year prior was working on a game code-named P3. Now, P3 was pretty much identical in its structure, in the systems and mechanics to what we saw with Dark and Darker. It was a fantasy extraction looter, dungeon diving game. The structure, the way the game was set up, what you did, how it all played out. P3 and Darker were very similar games. So after leaving that,
and like, look, there's part of me that says the timing is super coincidental, right? Like, they launch and release this game in beta, and that's when all the trouble starts because it was super successful. So it feels like they're coming after it because it's successful. But the counterpoint to that is they really wouldn't have known that this is exactly what they were working on until they get to see something. I think there's so many different ways to look at this, and I think the courts are going to have a hard time, but it does lend a lot to the whole, like, I don't think you're allowed to work on a project, take all these lessons learned on a project, and then leave the company or get fired from the company and say, well, that project was stupid, and then make one exactly the same and just change enough to make it different. And I know that there's a lot of like genre crossover, but there's also like business and IP non-compete, and it's a really hard line to walk. I want Dark and Dark to be successful, and I hope they win all their things, but that's coming from a fanboy kind of mentality, not the letter of the law, what actually happened in the case.
Nexon and forming Iron Mace Studio, while also taking some members of Nexon's P3 development team with him. They developed and launched Dark and Darker on Steam, and as just covered, it quickly became quite successful. And that success, of course, would likely mean loads of money when Dark and Darker eventually released. And so Nexon took notice, and they were not too thrilled. In turn, they filed a DMCA claim resulting in Dark and Darker being removed from Steam. They launched legal investigations, with the Korean police raiding Iron Mace Studios at one point, going into their offices and seizing equipment and hard drive. Nexon then also filed both criminal and civil lawsuits, both of which, as of today, are still currently in progress. So Nexon has a criminal case in Korea against Iron Mace's co-founder, Mr. Choi, as well as a civil case here in the US against Iron Mace Studios, attempting to prevent them from distributing the game on Steam or any other platform here in the West. The whole thing was just a massive mess. Now, in those first few weeks and months after these reports started popping up, we saw a ton of back and forth he said, she said reporting, but now that the dust has settled several months later, it seems pretty clear the general timeline of what happened. So some of the people who were working at Nexon,
and it is important, like the timeline breakdown is really important in this. And from what I've seen and kind of understand is that P3 was underway, one person left, he pulled a bunch of other people out of the P3 network, and then the project collapsed. So the argument is kind of the project collapsed because too much of the core staff left, which allowed P3 to collapse, and then they made Dark and Darker. So there's an argument to be made that the reason P3 will never come out is because Dark and Darker did what they did in the development. Oh no, there's a ton of shenanigans in this entire thing, and I think there's some merit to both sides of the argument. It's just which one is going to fall closer to the letter of the law when it comes to allowing it to release and clearing the court systems. And there's a good chance that this project, Dark and Darker, loses its case.
On Project P3, they were not all too happy with how the game's development was going. They didn't like Nexon's approach or many of the decisions that were being made. Specifically, they weren't too keen on their plans for monetizing P3. However, they did like the idea of a fantasy extraction game. They thought, hey, this is pretty good. We like what we're making. We just don't like what Nexon is doing. So they quit Nexon, form Iron Mace Studios, get some other people to also quit Nexon and join them, and then they started making their own version. That game, the thing that they came up with, Dark and Darker, as just recently mentioned, came to Steam, had the alpha tests, and those alpha tests received a resoundingly positive reception.
It was
lots
so
of
good.
People were playing, people were really excited about the game and really enjoying the game. Now, what's still up in the air as of this moment is how much, if any, code from P3 was used to start Dark and Darker's development. Of course, Iron Mace Studios says 0%, but Nexon thinks otherwise. In addition to the code, were any of P3 assets used to make Dark and Darker? Iron Mace once again says no. They state that all of the game's assets are either from the Unreal Engine marketplace or were handcrafted in-house. While Nexon, on the other hand, thinks that they've got proof about multiple stolen assets from P3 being used in Dark and Darker. All of this debate is still
the question on that is, a stolen asset just the code? Does the code have to match perfectly for it to be a stolen asset? And like, I guess, how do you prove, like, if none of the code matches exactly, but the end result matches closely, where is the, like, the line of demarcation, and how do you, because I think in a lot of genres there's a lot of aspects that overlay quite a bit without stolen code, so it's hard to see. Again, this line is very hard to cut, and it's going to depend on the court's interpretation of like copyright infringement and like internal kind of theft versus developing something that's in the same genre.
He settled in the Korean courts for the criminal case with Nexon trying to prove that Mr. Choi stole their stuff, be that code, be that assets, or quote, trade secrets, which basically means just taking the concept of the game, the idea of the game, all of the things that went into the game's development, taking that and then turning around and making your own project instead of going along with what they were making. And as a result of these apparent thefts, Nexon is looking for the resulting criminal consequences for Mr. Choi, with Mr. Choi's defense being, we didn't steal any code, we didn't steal any assets, sure the games are in the same genre, but who cares? On top of that, Nexon canceled the development, they stopped making P3, so that game apparently isn't even ever going to...
And that's like a huge argument, like genre tropes, the standard, this is a mythical genre class, like this belongs to sorcerers, this belongs to wizards, a ranger is this, an archer does that, like these generalized things, how much of them can you use before someone starts to say, well, you stole our idea? Because there are so many generalized ideas and notions within that world, right?
To see the light of day anyway, so they could make the argument that, hey, Nexon isn't even releasing P3, so Dark and Darker isn't competing with anything that they're doing as of yet. And again,
the counter argument to that is they're not releasing P3 because they lost too many people during this entire shakeup to continue the project. In essence, Iron Mace stole enough people from their development squad to kill the project for Nexon. Is the counterpoint to P3's not coming out, so is Nexon even losing anything or whatever?
Top of that criminal case, there is also the ongoing civil suit here in the US, where Nexon is trying to prevent Iron Mace Studios from distributing Dark and Darker in the West. In the midst of all of this,
so
Iron Mace, ongoing? At least publicly...
It's my understanding that that civil suit isn't necessarily ongoing. Maybe it's just on pause and the final verdict won't be released until after the criminal case in Korea, but it was my understanding that the civil suit kind of got either dropped or like put on hold pending the criminal case in Korea, is my understanding of the US civil suit.
Doesn't seem to give a damn. They've said, hey, don't worry, gamers. None of this is affecting development. We are still working on the game. In fact, they've gone as far after all of this stuff started kicking up and the lawsuits started going out and arrest warrants and Korean police searching their offices. In the midst of everything happening, Iron Mace started running additional playtests. In April, they held their 5th test for Dark and Darker. However, since the game was no longer available on Steam, they opened it up to be downloaded via torrent instead. Now, the rollout of this was a bit messy, with both Discord and Twitter removing the official announcement post due to their policies of not allowing links to torrents on these services. But ultimately, the test did go live, and it was successful, peaking at over 80,000 players, which for a torrent in 2023, that is
not
nuts.
Small.
Like, people don't know how to use torrents nowadays. The people who used to torrent stuff probably forgot. All the young kids probably don't even know what a torrent is. So it's crazy that they torrented a test that peaked at over 80,000 players. That just blows my mind. And the test came with a ton of additions as well, with them adding 2 brand new maps, a new class, new weapons and features, along with a bunch of bug fixes and quality of life improvements. All around, this 5th test of Dark and Darker was very successful. A lot of people played it, and it clearly showed that Iron Mace was still working on the game in spite of everything that was going on. Now, all of this up until this point is as of last April. Since then, there have been a few updates. On the development side,
it is going to be interesting to see if all of these actions of continuing playtest, using torrent, going with the third-party website, all of this stuff that continues the progression of their game to get it to launch and to market, they have to have some sort of legal counsel on this, like giving them ideas on whether this is something they go full bore on or not. But like, it's going to be interesting to see if any of this is used against them as we're snuffing the entire court system and we don't believe this is all malicious and we don't care what anyone is telling us to do. We're going to do what we want to do. Or if it's going to work in their favor in the fact that like we still have to run a business and we think this case is malicious and we can't allow it to slow down our progress, because if they allow it to slow down the progress, it will kill the brand and game. So there's this weird balance about whether or not this helps or hurt them once it gets into the court system. Again, Mischief, I want Iron Mace to win because I like the game, but I don't know enough about the Korean legal system versus the American, because it is a very different legal system, and I don't know how heavily they weigh this like non-compete standard and stuff like that. They're completely different legal systems, and you can't look at it from what a US legal system would look at it, and I don't know any of the laws for Korea to even have a baseline of where the precedent is in this case moving forward, which is something that like I can't really comment on. I want Iron Mace to win because I want the game to come out and come out fully with all the options, so that, you know, people don't have to worry about if they're going to get copyrights or anything like that just for playing the game or whatever.
Iron Mace is still plugging away. In fact, in the past 2 months, they have posted several new videos showcasing a lot of new stuff. They showed a brand new class, the Warlock, who casts curses that does things like reducing enemy stats or dealing damage over time. There's one that would sacrifice health for increased strength. All around, it seems like a pretty good support and offensive class. They also had map updates for both the ruins and the goblin caves. There were more new weapons added, like the Bard now can play drums
I don't
as
think
a
I
new
got to
weapon,
play the
and there were
Ruins
a
level.
few
That looks
other
pretty cool.
updated clips just showing us some more gameplay, a few more rounds, a few different scenarios, things like that. All in all, clearly development of the game is moving along nicely. Legally, though, things continue to be messy. There have been developments in both the criminal and civil cases. Plenty of paperwork filed, a lot of that pre-court date back and forth between the prosecution and the defense. Just last week, there was actually an arrest warrant filed for Mr. Choi in Korea. However, that has since been dismissed by a judge, so it looks like Mr. Choi is safe from jail time as of now. And then just as of yesterday, Iron Mace posted this massive 25-page response to the civil case that's ongoing here in the US. So the wheels are still churning on all fronts when it comes to the legal fight between Nexon and Mr. Choi, as well as Nexon
it's not a
and
quick
Iron
process.
Mace Studios. No definitive.
There is part of me that legitimately thinks that the play Nexon is trying to do is draw out all these court battles and monetize the hell out of the court system to the point where Iron Mace can no longer continue to function due to the outgoing money and legal fees. They're trying to circumvent that. Obviously, the game, they push to get certain products out and monetize what they have production-wise in order to kind of level out their like books, but it feels like Nexon is 100% trying to bankrupt them without having to actually go through the fight.
Conclusions one way or the other as of now, though. We simply don't know what is going to happen, how either the criminal case against Mr. Choi or the civil case against Iron Mace here in the States. We don't know how either one of these are going to turn out, and the results of both of these cases will have a massive impact on whether or not we will get to eventually play Dark and Darker, whether or not they will be legally able to distribute this game. What we do know is that Iron Mace is still clearly working on the game. They hope to win their legal battles, obviously, and with the goal of releasing Dark and Darker. And I would say we hope so too. And I say we because one thing that's been pretty clear over these past 8 or so months of this debacle is what side the gamers are on between Nexon and Iron Mace. And it's Iron Mace all the way. There has just been a ton of community goodwill across the board.
This one's any question. Nexon has already had a past kind of reputation of going after companies over inflated IP kind of theft lawsuits. So as far as the court of public opinion, I don't think there's any case in which Nexon is leading Iron Mace. Iron Mace has the public support. They have the majority of people behind them. But in all cases, courts don't run off public opinion. So, again, super hopeful and optimistic that they can continue their path without getting impeded by Nexon. But the system is what it is, and it's a system that I don't understand because it's not even America's. Switch is interesting because after this, I don't see people in the West supporting Nexon games. I think people in video games have a very short memory, and I think companies overcome this kind of like, we hate this company mentality very quickly in gaming, because this one's a little different in the fact that it feels shady and it's trying to stop another company from developing. But like when a game flops, a company can turn that ship around with their next launch pretty quickly. I think Redfall and Fallout 76 kind of prove the point to that degree, because Starfield is super hyped and everyone's looking forward to it, even though Redfall and Fallout 76 were pretty disappointing for the gaming community as a whole.
For Iron Mace Studios, largely due to this just being a good game. People tried it, they really enjoyed playing it, and they would like to continue playing it. So selfishly, yes, many people just want to see Iron Mace win so that they can release Dark and Darker and we can keep playing. But also on top of that, I think part of the sentiment around all of this, the legal proceedings and the development of this game, boils down to the attitude of the development studio. Iron Mace is very much so positioning themselves as the underdog, the David to Nexon's Goliath. Which they are. They're an indie studio. However much funding they have or don't have, they are very small fry.
And I see that point, Reckless. I think, 76 was. 76 was made by Bethesda's main, but Redfall, you are correct. That was a company and Bethesda was the publisher, but Bethesda's still stamping their name on it. And I think it speaks volumes that Xbox apologized for Redfall, but I don't think Bethesda really did. If that makes sense. Xbox came out and said, we missed the mark completely on Redfall. Bethesda didn't say really much of anything on it. And obviously it was a sub studio that said they were burnt out and they lost passion in the project closer to launch or something like that. But so, I mean, 76 was still Bethesda main though. I thought it was anyway. But I do see your point, but they still put their name on it, right? So, yeah. I guess there's two coins to that argument. I mean, there's two sides to every coin, right?
Surprise when compared to the massive conglomerate that is Nexon. Now, in fact, going as far as to, in the About Us section on their website, to really take this stance and solidify it. It says here, we are a merry band of veteran game developers disillusioned by the exploitative and greedy practices we once helped create. We are experts who have worked on many of the biggest hits in Korea. We've seen firsthand how corporate game companies sell their soul for the easy payday. We are disappointed to see them doubling down on more and more exploited.
I think this divide is like increasing and increasing in the game space where developers are no longer happy with the major studios and publishers and how they push towards marketing and selling of microtransactions that kind of ruin the passion projects of developers themselves. And I think the gaming industry needs to acknowledge this and move forward, because developers are going to give the best product for the gamer, and publishers and marketing needs to understand that that's what draws engagement and helps monetization, not all the other things they want to put in it. So what I'm seeing is 76 was made by Bethesda Austin, which is the studio they had recently acquired at the time, so not their 18. That's fair. That's like a middle ground kind of. It is a Bethesda main studio, but it's not one of their established main studios. I guess that point can kind of that holds some weight. I'll take that, Reckless. I'm not defending them, by the way. 76 was inexcusable. Yeah, but and that's the point, right? Like the short-sightedness between like a studio can make an inexcusable trash game, or a publisher can put out a sub studio's game, and like 2 games later people will ignore that game or not talk about it because it's inexcusable and just kind of move on. So I don't think Nexon gets destroyed by this, even though it's very bad on them. I think gamers are going to play the games that they're interested in, and a large majority of gamers don't care about the politics or behind the scenes of the gaming industry enough to say that like Nexon's gonna die because they're screwing with Dark and Darker. I guess my larger point is Nexon doesn't die because gamers have this like morality where we will all band together, even though like they may make a game that appeals to certain groups, right?
Practices becoming more like casinos instead of bringing joy to gamers. What self-respected gamer is going to argue with that? I mean, that is quite the statement, and you know, words are one thing, actions are another. Dark and Darker hasn't released. We don't really know for sure what their final monetization method is going to be, how much, if any, predatory microtransactions will be thrown in there.
I mean, they did have a quite the statement,
right? And it's hard to
so
look at that and be like,
it's hard to say that they don't plan on microtransactions at all, because they had a store with coins that weren't available in any of the games that I played. So at some point they plan on skins and some form of microtransaction, right? So it's not a fully holier than thou argument with what they're developing, right?
Like, boy, I really side with Nexon, especially when Nexon is very much so the embodiment of the thing that they say they're fighting against, with the predatory monetization, with the games that feel a lot more like casinos that are just reaching for your wallet and trying to keep you paying and playing, but not really so much interested in delivering a truly authentic, good old-fashioned video game that you play because it's fun to play, rather just trying to make something that's addictive and you play because your lizard brain keeps you playing. So yeah, suffice it to say, people are in support of Iron Mace.
Just
this is where a lot of the rallying
gameplay.
cry from the community online. Honestly, I don't even know why I have to try to explain this. Who's out there waving the flag for Nexon, right? I suppose, though, like when it comes to right and wrong, you know, if they made this game off of the back of stolen code and stolen assets, that is certainly an issue. It would be far more ideal if Dark and Darker from scratch was made with brand new fresh code, no stolen assets. The trade secret side of things, I understand that like legally a Nexon might have some grounds when it comes to that. I think like
trade secrets is a hard one because it's really hard to prove like what did you learn organically in developing that game versus like what carries over. Trade secrets is almost that's such a hard line to cross because it's all what's stored in your brain and you can't tell what they used versus what they didn't use.
Philosophically,
it's like
you know how many of every type of genre of game exist, and the fact that Nexon isn't even releasing P3, they've halted development. Whatever, Nexon, like take a hike, seriously. Like this is a cool genre of game. This is something that people after getting their hands
Nexon,
on clearly really enjoyed, and we want to keep on playing it. Just seems like sour grapes in this situation because they canceled P3. They could have continued development. I know part of the argument for Nexon canceling P3 comes down to the fact that Mr. Choi and company left the game and started developing their own thing, and they were pretty high up in the development of P3. But Nexon's big enough that they could have found more people to continue supporting the project if they saw merit in it. They clearly did not place their chips there, and now it just looks like after the success of these alpha playtests for Dark and Darker, they're just upset that they aren't the ones releasing it, and they're not the ones monetizing and cashing out on it. And we all know how a Nexon version of Dark and Darker would have turned out. It would have been absolutely full of microtransactions, like
accurate,
just all the way up to the teeth. Like, so it's hard to, it's very hard to feel bad for them in this situation.
It is hard to feel bad for them because it is very much after the fact. All of a sudden they're like, wait, this genre actually could really pop off, even though we kind of decided to walk away from it. And I think his point that they could have completely restaffed the project if they wanted to, given their size, is a pretty valid argument.
Even if they do have a legal ground to stand on. But it doesn't really matter how I feel or how the gamers feel, because yes, a lot of this is going to boil down to how the civil case turns out in the States and how that legal case turns out in Korea. Although I do believe that the criminal case against Mr. Choi, even if that is successful for Nexon, I don't believe that halts development of Dark and Darker. It is really the civil case in the US, because it is the civil case in the US that is against Iron Mace Studios. The criminal case is just against one person in Korea. Well, we'll have to see how.
That's a good point, I guess, because realistically, if they lose the criminal case against Choi, they could get rid of him. Basically, I mean, he goes to jail, right? So the company cuts him loose, and then the company is free to like move forward. But I think losing that criminal case would severely hinder any civil cases here in the US, because it's almost proof of ill-gotten materials that crossed the line, right? So I think that criminal case, while it wouldn't take down the company because it's one person, would definitely hurt the civil case because it's almost proof of what they're alleging, right?
How this all plays out, it is again still up in the air. When it comes to what's next with Dark and Darker, well, it's a whole lot of rumor and speculation. You know, you've got people out there saying that the game is going to be back on Steam, launching any day now. Yeah, okay. Part of this is fueled by the fact that recently the game got a PEGI 16 rating. PEGI is the European content rating system for games, the US equivalent of this being the ESRB, which, mind you, ESRB still has not rated Dark and Darker, so there is that. And the original release window for Dark and Darker,
I think they did the rating system specifically for their third-party launcher systems. that they're working on.
Darker was slated for Q4 2023, although at this point that seems pretty much impossible given these ongoing legal battles and how we are expecting these to take at least a few more months to conclude. So really, at this point, we are just in limbo until this stuff gets resolved, which does suck for people like myself who like Dark and Darker and would like to continue playing it, but that is just the fact of the matter.
And to hold on hope, like, I don't think Steam touches this with a 10-foot pole until all of the legal issues are closed out. I don't think Steam would risk even looking at putting this game up until all of the legal systems have ruled one way or the other, just because it's too high risk for them.
We are just sitting here waiting for this stuff to finish, waiting for the game to be legally allowed to be distributed here in the West or otherwise. When talking about this, I've looked around like curious, Dark and Darker turned out really awesome. Very cool concept. Is anyone else making something like this? And there are apparently some alternatives.
Okay.
Someone pointed me to this game, Dungeon Stalkers.
One day, an enormous dungeon emerged in between two countries. A huge dungeon created by a mysterious witch.
I'm not useless.
A witch?
I'm...
My daughter has gone into the dungeon. I need to save her. She's probably trembling in the dark. What happened in this dungeon?
Gotta say, not looking really good. Now, so yes, I do hope that Dark and Darker succeeds. I hope that Iron May Studios wins their case. They win the civil case here in the States. They're allowed to continue development and allowed to publish the game here in the West. Other than that, I also just hope that developers take this as a sign that there is a thirst for this kind of game. I guess kind of similar to the whole Day Before fiasco with all of the excitement behind this idea of a new survival zombie MMO. Looks like the Day Before isn't going to be that. I hope new developers, other developers, take the opportunity to make a new zombie survival MMO, because clearly there's a thirst for it. And similarly, clearly there is a thirst for a dungeon diving loot extraction game that's fantasy based instead of being military shooter based. There's a thirst for this. Dark and Darker proved, if done well, people will really enjoy it. And I'm hoping we see more games developed. I want Dark and Darker to come through. I think this is a good game in and of itself, but I'd also like to see more developers take a crack at the genre, because it's pretty darn fun when done right. So there you go. That is it. An update for Dark and Darker, everything that's happened over these past 12 or so months. Thank you for watching. I will keep you updated.
Yes, please do keep us updated. I'm going to drop the link for you guys so that you can go and like the video. What a champ. Like, he does really good content. I like his commentary a lot. I think more than just looking at the genre of dungeon crawling loot extractor in this like magical world, I would hope that something like that game and a couple other games that are coming out take the AAA space to a place where they're more willing to take more risk with new IPs, because I think that's the broader issue, is that people are looking for new forms of content, not just the same game in a new skin. I think we've gotten to a place in gaming where every company wants to play it safe and build the next game based on a genre that's doing well right now. And it's almost like this cookie cutter system where we get the same style of game on top of the same style of game. And it lasts for like 2 or 3 years, and then they slowly rotate to a new one. And like, I think we just need a more healthy rotation of new ideas and IPs and different game styles coming out, instead of everything being stacked where it's the same game coming out after the same game after the same game. But I hope this works out for Dark and Darker. I want it to come out. Make sure you check out Force Gaming. Great content. Can't wait to get into the game if they win all their legal battles. Like and subscribe. Do this stuff. You want all that? All of that. Hey there, it's Skeg Broggy. Thanks for watching the video. And if you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and follow me here on Twitch for more awesome content. Link is in the description.